let's take this off. How's this mic working? Can you hear me up there in the corner? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Hobo Joe was this little stuffed animal guy that my dad got me when I was a little kid. My dad used to travel a lot, and you know, that was back in the day where there's no cell phones. When Dad went and traveled, you kind of didn't hear from him for a week or two, other than maybe a 30-second phone call, but he'd always come back with a little something. And one time he came back with this little sock person, like this little sock thing, and he was this hobo, and he had like a tear, and he had a little thing, cigar, and he had like a little, you know, those little knapsacks. And like Hobo Joe was my best buddy for a whole bunch of years, and then one day Hobo Joe disappeared. And so it was always like, you know, what happened to Hobo Joe? And so then later I decided that Hobo Joe like had gone around the world, and at one point I was buying a lot of real estate for some crazy reason, and I decided that Hobo Joe had actually gone around the world and bought all this real estate and then turned it over to me. And then I had the Hobo Joe Land and Cattle Company. Even though I own no cattle, I figured if you had a land company, you had to have a cattle company. So anyway, that's who Hobo Joe is. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought, even though the topic was leadership and character, which I want to talk about that a little bit and have that be an area that we can have a conversation about, I thought I might provide a little bit of just context about a quick little snapshot of my life and what I do, you know, where most of my leadership is focused. As I said earlier in a leadership class, at home I don't have a lot of leadership because we have a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a newborn. And our 5-year-old is a girl, so she runs the entire operation. So I'm kind of, you know, like way low in the leadership scale when I'm in the home because Rosalia runs the household. But at Seagate, I'm mostly, well, I'm definitely responsible for being in charge. Whether or not I'm really in charge is a different question. So I started, I grew up outside of Chicago, and in 1976, went out to California and went to school at Stanford, and I majored in economics and neuropsychology. Now, this was back, you know, when, by the way, we were talking at dinner. In fact, believe it or not, Harvey Mudd was never even on my list of considerations because I figured there was no way I could ever get into Harvey Mudd. That was the reputation that Harvey Mudd had in the Midwest. I had gone to University of Illinois for a year, and I wanted to transfer, but it was a really good school, and my dad had 3 boys, and you know, the prospect of going to a private school was very difficult. So I knew I had to go to a really great school. I knew Stanford was good, and I knew Harvard was good, so I applied to both those places. But I thought Stanford was in Southern California on the ocean, okay? So back when I applied to Stanford, you could actually not even know where the school was and get in. So I went to Stanford, I majored in econ and neuropsychology, and then I did programming work. I was a Fortran programmer for a couple of years, and I did systems analysis and systems architecture for mainframes or minis. And then I went back to business school at Stanford. And then after that, I worked for Salomon Brothers for 8.5 years in investment banking, mostly doing mergers and acquisitions work around technology companies that were shifting out of proprietary architectures, and they were being challenged by what was then called open, which was really just a new, different proprietary architecture called Microsoft and Intel. And then I worked a 1.5 years at Bear Stearns when Salomon Brothers got in trouble with what was known as the Treasury scandal. The firm tried to corner the Treasury market, and a lot of my friends left the firm, and a lot of friends were blamed for things they didn't do. And so I took my team to Bear Stearns, and then Seagate was one of my big customers and clients, and Al Shugart, who was the founder of Seagate and one of the true legends of technology in Silicon Valley, asked me to come and acquire software companies for him because this was the beginning of the client-server transition, and Al wanted to reposition Seagate to have a software capability, and he knew that rotation out of the old architecture was going to create opportunity. So I led that effort, and we bought 14 companies in a few years, and we kind of rolled them all up and integrated them, and then we were about to take them public in 1998, and then Veritas decided they wanted to buy it. And in one of the great negotiations of all time, we were going to take the company public for about $1.2 billion, and so we decided that if we sold it, we wanted $1.2 billion. And we had to split into these 3 businesses, networking and storage and information management. And we were going to sell all 3, but the CEO of Veritas called and said that he wanted to buy, the company, and we sat down and negotiated, and he said, well, I'm willing to pay you $1.2 billion. This is the first meeting, when I have my attorney with me, and so you're basically getting your bid, before anything started. But he said, but we only want to buy the storage management and the network management piece. So I was with a friend of mine who's a very well-known attorney now named Larry Sonsini, and we said, well, we really need some time to think about this. And we went over in the other room and we were like, what do you do now? Like they've already beat our bid. So we said, well, let's, we talked about sports for a while, and then we went back out and said, look, we really like the offer, but we really think these businesses all belong together. So would you make us a bid that way? And he came back and they said, they went back and then they came back and we said, okay, we'll give you $1.4 billion, but we only want the network and storage management business. so Larry and I look at each other and go, okay. And then we ended up keeping that other business and selling it to Business Objects a few years later for $2 billion. The $1.4 billion turned into $22 billion in about 18 months because it was the internet bubble. And I thought that was crazy. So we did a transaction that's been generally regarded as the best technology buyout ever, where we actually sold our ownership back to Veritas. And by doing that, we avoided all the capital gains, which was $19 billion of gains. So it would have been a $6 or $7 billion tax bill. And then we basically took Seagate private. So it was the first time a tech company had gone private. And it was about $1 billion of equity, which back in 2000 was a lot of money. We went public again in 2002. The privatization yielded about a 15-to-1 return, which was, again, it's the highest return ever on a tech buyout. And then I was, I started in 93, I was made president in 97, CEO in 98. I was the youngest CEO of a Fortune 200 company. We had 112,000 employees when I took over. We were the largest employer in Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. Although we couldn't say we were the largest employer in Singapore because Singapore Airlines wouldn't have accepted that, so we had to say that Singapore Airlines had one more employee than we did. And then I retired in 2004 to do charity work and to take care of my mom, and who I was extremely close to, and she was getting older, and she had 6 different bouts of cancer, and I spent 4 years living with my mom, which was like fantastic. I'd retired and I'd be going on these surfing trips for a couple of months, and about 4 weeks into it, I'd say, I got to go home, and my buddies would be like, why? And I was like, I miss my mom. So it was really great. And then Seagate got in trouble in 2008 with kind of bad financial policies, and when the recession happened and the credits market seized up, the company was at financial risk. So I came back in 2009 for a year to turn it around, and that was 6 years ago. And I've had an absolute blast. So I wanted to show you a video real quick, if I might. And we'll go over some of this, but I really want to get to the leadership stuff, but I do want to provide the context. So again, Seagate is about 55,000 employees today. We make anywhere from 50 to 60 million drives per quarter. We run about 14 billion parts a quarter through our factories. And these devices are, as high tech as you can imagine. It's subatomic physics that we're dealing with. We have 2 to 3 times the process steps that silicon wafers have in our wafers that make our heads. Our media has 14 to 20 layers of magnetics on it, some of them that are basically half the size of an atom because we stack them. And this head is basically flying inside a device that's spinning at 15,000 RPM, 6 million lines of code, and it all has to come together in a machine that you sell cheaper and cheaper and cheaper every year. Unlike most companies in the world that are either in manufacturing or technology, we're vertically integrated, so we actually own most of the key underlying technology, and we make it, and we make the machines that make it. So it's a really different kind of company than really most exist today, because most manufacturing companies, as you know, have outsourced a lot of the real manufacturing to, quote, contract manufacturers. For us, we just can't do it from a tolerance perspective or a technology perspective or an ability to ramp to yield or lots of different reasons. So it's a really cool business that way. We're all over the world. You can see that's, including sales and, overhead, as I call it, but, really the manufacturing and the design side is pretty extensive as well. So we have physical presence in about 40 different countries. And we do about $15 billion in revenue. Our profits are between $2.5 and $3 billion a year. One of the things that Seagate's done very differently, and we can talk about finance stuff if you want as well, is we've been a real trailblazer in returning value to our shareholders. So we take about half of our cash flow, our free cash flow, and we return it to shareholders either in the term of buybacks or dividends, which some of you may know for tech companies is very unusual because they feel that if you're returning cash, that it's a statement that you don't have any, anything for the future, and anything to invest for in the future. And I think that's absolutely backwards, and it's reflective of our leadership, which is really, if you have faith about what you've invested in, there's going to be cash flow, so you don't need to pile up all this cash. And the fact that tech companies historically did that was because if they missed a product cycle, they had to have enough money on the balance sheet to pay all their employees while the next product cycle came. And in some cases, if you missed a product cycle, that meant, you might be out of the market for a year or two or three. But for companies like Apple, for example, today, to claim that they need, to keep money on their balance sheet because you're going to miss a product cycle is absurd. I mean, they're not going to ever miss a product cycle. They are the product cycle. And you certainly don't need $250 billion if you miss a product cycle on top of it. So Seagate's been way out in front on that. And finally, you're starting to see a lot of tech companies actually give dividends to their shareholders. Microsoft's been a great dividend payer, actually. I'm going to play this video if it's okay. If it feels like it's getting too long, I might stop it. But it gives a pretty good overview of what we do in the factory, and I just thought it might be helpful, and then we'll go into leadership stuff if that's okay with everyone. Oops. I did that before. Oh, we need audio. Do we have a tech person here? So we lost our audio. See? Always a problem solver.
Technical challenges around data storage. We're adding new capabilities in enterprise storage systems, solid-state technologies, high-performance computing, and introducing new products that leverage more than 30 years of hard disk drive innovation, which has produced many breakthroughs.
Is audio up on here? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, try it again. Sorry about that, folks. It was working earlier today.
Innovating continuously and reacting quickly to emerging trends has enabled Seagate to remain at the forefront of the storage industry, leveraging our
Okay, no problem. I can handle this. We don't need the video. Trust me, it's a really cool company that does really amazing manufacturing with these amazing robots that are doing vision systems. I told the story at dinner, so when the Thai floods happened a couple of years ago, and the drive industry was completely shut down because the supply chain, so much of the supply chain comes out of Thailand. And people wondered, like, well, why? Why can't they just make more of these things really quickly? The reasons why was because we couldn't find any equipment or any industry that could provide us with the tolerances that we needed to make disk drives. We went to the aerospace industry, and they were, are you kidding us? We don't do anything close to this, 2 orders of magnitude different in tolerances, and we do it at like 1/10 the cost. So it's an amazing technology, and getting more amazing. I think one of the great things about drives is if you look at 10 years of technical roadmaps, we have more confidence today than in any 10-year period of time about our ability to continue to basically deliver twice the amount of storage that you have at half the cost. So today, if you had disk drives in your computers, some of you do if you're value creators, or if you're big consumers of video, you have 1 or 2 terabytes. We sell 6, 8 terabyte drives into the cloud. By the end of the decade, we'll have 20 terabyte drives. which is just staggering if you think about it. So the technology has a lot of legs left on it. And we do it at almost 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than silicon. So these trends are trends that are going on. These are the ones that we kind of have to operate in terms of the envelope that we think about leadership, strategic leadership, or other leadership, which is, there's a big transition in computing architectures. Most people will say cloud or hyperscale or converged infrastructure. But all of those things kind of mean the same thing, which one way to think about it is timeshare 30 years forward. Another way to think of it is just a pool of compute, a pool of networking, and a pool of storage that can be accessed dynamically as needed, whereas before the architectures that people were deploying, especially in enterprises, was for a particular application, i.e. HR. You scoped an architecture that had some amount of compute and some amount of networking and some amount of storage to solve that task. And then if you needed increments, the increments had to come in big blocks to justify the cost. So this is more of an ability to scale linearly, but also shift the resources around. So if you have a big workload that needs storage right now, then you just basically change the dials on your control panel and more storage is available, but then you can shift that to networking or you can shift to compute. And you can do that across applications. So it's just way cheaper, way more scalable, and way more available. So a lot of this is being driven by mobile, because all of us have these mobile devices, but we want access to information real time, quickly and reliably. And so you basically have to have some way of storing all that stuff and accessing it. So the cloud and mobility have kind of grown up together. And so this is kind of the world that we think about. And then, these are kind of the elements from a market perspective. Big data growth issues, especially if you're, storing, 8K video. One of the reasons Google has such a massive need for back-end storage is because of YouTube. And, nobody wants to delete that stuff. And of course, if you're shooting something in 8K, you don't want to really compress it even. Hyperscale architectures, again, how do you get something that ramps very quickly? Hybrid cloud, which is where basically people are going to have clouds that are both owned by a particular company as well as leveraging off the clouds that are public clouds like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft or Google or Baidu. And then I think, as you all know, the business models are at risk for most of the major incumbents because of these architectural shifts. So this is kind of the world that we live in and how we reposition our company constantly to take advantage of the trends as Maria was talking about. So to do that, we've done a bunch of acquisitions, some in the silicon area, because as you know, flash is becoming silicon is becoming more of an important technology in storage, or at least in fast memory. We bought a big systems company because a lot of our companies don't want to build storage systems anymore. They just want to be software and services companies, but someone has to build the hardware, and we're really good at hardware. We have a services company called eVault, and then Luczo is a brand that you may be familiar with, which is a external drive brand that we acquired a few years ago. So Seagate's been doing a lot of M&A work as well, which has its own host of issues around leadership. So that's just kind of the backdrop, who I am, where I came from, what Seagate does. And then I just want to spend a few minutes on this, but really open it up for Q&A. And again, you can address your questions to technical things or leadership things or financial markets, where I spent a lot of my life. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about and talking and working on leadership. I'm a big Roman history student, and I spend what little free hours I have away from the kids in Seagate, studying different eras of Roman history. In particular, I like Caesar and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, but I get drawn into Greek history as a result. And I've really studied a lot of kind of the characteristics of the writings of some of the great leaders, whether or not they're military leaders or political leaders. And then through my life, I've just been fortunate to meet, some of the great leaders in the world. One of who just passed away yesterday, Lee Kuan Yew, who really took Singapore from absolutely nothing to one of the really most economically successful countries in the world, fifth highest per capita GDP, and it's amazing. It all happened in 50 years. And people, we were joking earlier, people always say, well, but that's just because it was 5 million people. But 5 million people is still a lot of people to lift from abject poverty, kind of across the board to that kind of economic prosperity. And the man was an incredible leader. I mean, it was all about leadership. I mean, he was smart, and he was well educated, but his leadership capabilities were just phenomenal. And I think actually fall into this definition. So for me, I'm big on semantics, and I feel it's an area where our world is moving away from too quickly in terms of actually holding people accountable to defining words or using words in the right way. So I like to start with defining at least what I'm calling leadership, which is, and I've highlighted kind of, the keywords, which is, it's behavior, action, from an individual, because I'm mostly talking about how a leader affects a team in this case, that motivates others to accomplish. And I think motivate's an important word, because you're not telling someone what to do. You're basically creating a set of circumstances and constructs that allow people to fulfill themselves to their highest capabilities, as opposed to telling them what to do. And they have to accomplish something extraordinary or important. And I think that's important because leadership's really about getting people rallied around to solve the really big problem. And that's where great leadership is needed. And when I think about some of the major problems that are facing our world today, it's a really strange time in terms of the need we have for great leaders, and yet the pool of great leaders, I think, is eroding, because the people who end up in leadership positions on the political side are typically not people who follow a construct like this. And the problems of humanity are entering a phase that we've never really entered a phase. And the two areas that I think about are education and the environment. Really, for the first time in human history, humanity as a whole has got to make a trade-off that individuals make all the time, which is sacrificing a current condition for the benefit of a future condition. And we do that individually often. Probably all of us are in this room today because sacrifices that our parents made, our grandparents made, or our great-grandparents made. And it's important to recognize that, which a lot of people forget to recognize that anymore. It's like, no, I'm great. And the second part is, but that has to happen now on a human scale, on a macro scale, because the issues that are facing us, and access to education, brains are not allocated by income, but we're allocating education by income, and that's going to cause a big problem for us as a country, and it's going to cause a problem for us globally, because we're not getting the most out of the human talent that we have, because we're allocating the resources to make them greater by a function of income. And the only way to solve that problem is if we decide as a group that that's just not acceptable. And the environmental issues are even more complex. We can now trend line what's going to happen in 2050, 2060, 2070 in most of the major Earth systems. And it's not, it's not pretty. And the math is actually fairly solid at this point. And for anyone that doesn't believe that, just take a few minutes and really go to some of the core research institutions. The math is getting very solid about what's happening in acidity in the ocean, or various other things. And actually, if anything, they've been conservative about the trends, because they've kind of implied that things stay the same as opposed to maybe get worse. And the theory that somehow technology is going to solve this problem, so don't get too stressed about it, is just silliness. Because the problem is that the stuff that starts going wrong in 2050, 2060, 2070 needs to be addressed sometime in the next 15 or 20 years, or there's no stopping the train. And to therefore address these issues, collectively we have to sacrifice. And the United States has the biggest role to play in this. It's easier for us to tell lots of other countries how they should develop the resources and whether or not they can have coal plants or not. But the reality is it's our consumer behavior that's driving most of the demands on the Earth's resources. So we have to decide that we're going to have a lifestyle that's different than the one we have today in order for our children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren to have a place that, at least environmentally, is probably more comfortable than it's headed for. Humanity's never made those trade-offs before. It's done it individually. And it's going to be really interesting to see, how do we develop the leaders that can communicate that message and motivate people to do this really difficult thing, which is to sacrifice for some other people's grandchildren. So to me, that's why this is kind of so important. And then take ownership of the outcome. The people that are affecting the outcome should own the outcome as long as it's positive. And so if it's negative, the leader should, I think. So for Seagate, as a CEO, when we do things well, I mean, I always make it a point to say it's the employees, it's the leadership team, it's the board, it's not me. But when things go wrong, it's me. And I think that's eroded. And it's eroded kind of in a weird way, that because there's so much value and attention to celebrity, that people find it easy to forget that they can't do anything without their teams. And you know, especially in Silicon Valley, where the celebrity entrepreneur is so celebrated, and unfortunately, a lot of those leaders don't actually tell the real story about where the first idea came from or how many other people it took. Or I was saying earlier today, you know, one of the most notable entrepreneurs in the Valley today is a person who, you know, effectively hijacked U.S. government spending, you know, that we all, you know, spent a lot of money on for decades. But, you know, it's a good sales tool. So I think taking ownership of the outcome is really important. So what I've done is I've broken this down into a little play on the word leadership. And I start, sometimes I do this with each letter meaning something different, or like little phrases. This one I use the little phrases. But it could be learn, empower, advise, delegate, or learn to empower, advise, delegate. Sometimes I switch advise and with adapt, because I think one of the great things about leaders is they have to be able to adapt, because it's really about a dynamic situation that you're thinking about leadership. If it was a static situation, leadership would be fairly easy. It's the fact, though, that the world's always changing very quickly in unpredictable ways, that you have to have some sort of model that allows you to, you know, adapt to whatever you thought your plan of attack was. And learn is an important word, because learn implies that you have to be open-minded and willing to accept that you really don't know everything as a leader. You may have a point of view, but that doesn't mean you know anything. I was being interviewed the other day with several hundred CEOs, and you know, someone said, I've spent a lot of time on China issues, you know, and someone said, you know, wanted an answer about what my view was about, you know, the future of China, you know, as a business partner or whatever. And you know, I kind of said, well, you know, I don't know. And then they asked me some other question, and I said, I don't know. And you know, the person said, why am I interviewing you if you don't know anything? And I said, well, I have a point of view on all that stuff, but I'm not going to pretend for a second that I know. Because as I've gotten older, the only thing I do know is I know less and less. Like, I was really smart when I was 20, let me tell you. I was really smart when I was 20, and I had a lot of energy. And as you get older and life presents you with a series of challenges, what's really funny is the things that you were so sure about at 20 and 24 and 28 and 30 and 32, you know, you actually, in some cases, I've come completely full circle on stuff. You know, that completely opposite point of view, which is why now I wish my dad was around and say, like, sorry, Dad, you were right. I was a jerk about that stuff. And then empowering, you know, again, how do you motivate people to do things? How do you give them the tools to help make a decision as opposed to telling them? Be there to advise and delegate. And to do all that, you have to have clear communication about goals and measures. Because if you don't provide a context around what you're trying to achieve and are you making progress, then it's just too hard to kind of, you know, keep the ball moving in the right direction. And along with that, it means you have to have a review concept and a reward concept. So again, you know, what are we trying to do? How do we measure it? What happens if we're doing it? And I think reward is one of the things that we're not doing well as a society also, again, in terms of really rewarding and honoring great accomplishment. You know, too often when we do something great, we don't take time to celebrate anymore. Whether or not it's, you know, a kid's graduation or, you know, solving some tough problem. You know, it's kind of like we just move on to the next thing. And it's kind of not, I don't think it's productive because you lose the feedback mechanism of actually feeling the sense of accomplishment. And again, the world's moving so fast, a lot of times we're rewarding stuff that actually didn't even happen. And then by the time someone says, wait a second, that isn't really what happened, you know, the world's moved on. And no one really wants to get into the messy details of the fact that it did or didn't happen. And I think it's something we have to watch out for because the consequences of losing real connection between cause and effect can be pretty disastrous if you think about it from a systems perspective. At the middle of the word, I put earn respect. It's the fulcrum of the word, and I think it's the fulcrum of what a great leader does. I think a great leader has to earn respect. And like I said, I've known some great leaders, and Ronnie Lott's a very good friend of mine, and some of you may know he was a really good football player, and he was generally, you know, described as being the heart and soul of the 49ers, even though Joe Montana was, you know, the leader and the quarterback. And I remember talking to Ronnie about this. I actually did an interview with Ronnie and Joe about this, and Ronnie said, well, to get respect, you got to get respect. And at first I thought, you know, he was just like getting it wrong, you know, saying it wrong. And then I realized, no, that's what he meant. You know, like in order to get respect, you have to get respect. You have to be respectful. So to earn respect, you have to show respect. If you don't respect someone else, they're going to pick that up immediately, and they're not going to trust you. And if they don't trust you, they don't respect you, and you're not going to be able to basically motivate them. How do you show respect? You have to have a consistent code of conduct. And I think this is another thing that we're kind of losing in our society, and it relates to rewarding. You know, how you conduct yourself personally across a wide variety of situations is what gives people confidence that they know who you are or not. And too often, what we see happening is people who claim they have a certain code of conduct, and then they're exposed for really not having that code of conduct. But again, the world moves on too quick to say, well, wait a second, why was that? You know, why wasn't that person behaving in the way they said they were supposed to, which was what established him as a leader to begin with? And a lot of times the answer will be, well, this person made me do it, or, you know, there's never any kind of, the amount of people who actually can stand up and say, I just really screwed up, and there's really no excuse for it. And I probably even shouldn't be a leader. You know, it just doesn't happen, right? It's always someone else's fault. And it's just, again, I think something that we've gotten sloppy on as a society. And so to me, you have to have self-respect and virtue. And, you know, virtue is such a great word. And, you know, most of us don't even use that word anymore, virtue. Or if we do, we think it means, you know, dressing conservatively or something. But, you know, virtue in the old days meant conducting yourself and doing things in a way for the greater good. And it wasn't about self-promotion. It was about a code of conduct philosophically that placed others ahead of yourself. And then that was the code that you lived by in order to, you know, to be an effective leader. And I think it's absolutely critical. I think people that actually do consistently reflect these types of behaviors are the ones that end up being great leaders. And then the final piece I have is solicit honest input from peers. And I think, you know, this is an area where, especially in technology and with some of the, you know, technology leaders who have, you know, kind of gotten very powerful in a very short period of time, you know, they tend to basically start believing it all instead of actually looking to others and say, you know, be honest with me, tell you what we really think. You know, one, they either don't ask for it or they certainly don't want to hear it. And I think it's just a big weakness. So again, how do you create a system around leadership that makes sure that the team always has a capability to speak their mind and to basically say, you know, I disagree. It doesn't mean anybody should be mean. You know, like someone asked me something about, you know, brutal honesty. Can that person be brutally honest? Well, I don't think anybody should be brutally honest. That doesn't sound very nice. But you should be able to be honest and express your point of view and have that be an input that gets considered in a decision. And I think part of that is, and this is projection because I was a terrible listener. I'm not sure I'm a great listener even still, but it's hard to solicit honest input if you're never listening. And I remember I was on a tour when I was made CEO of Seagate. I was really young, and I got access to a lot of things that just because of that. And I remember going on a nuclear destroyer when I was quite young, and I met this guy who was 28 years old. He was a captain. He was 4 levels of command ahead of the next closest graduate out of his class in the Naval Academy. And 28 years old, running this destroyer. And it hit me all of a sudden. Every time I asked him a question, he waited for me to finish the question. I was like, man, I never do. Like, that's it. And he only answered the question I asked. And I was like, man, I wish I could do that. And the reason I can't do it is because I'm usually answering the question before the person's even stopped. And that's really rude. And so I got into this trick of saying, I did my Jedi mind trick of saying, when someone's talking to you, listen to them as if you're speaking. Because when I speak, being the arrogant megalomaniac I am, I'm 100% focused on what I'm saying. I was like, why can't you use the same discipline when you're listening? And I started doing that, and I realized that as I did that, I started hearing things that I didn't even know were there before, that then made me a better informed leader about how to pursue a course of action. And I would just say it's something that I think is really powerful. And it's based on having the confidence to consider a different point of view. Because one of the reasons you tend not to listen is because you think you already know the answer. And my answer is right, because I've thought about it. But if you go back to my thing of saying, as I've gone through life, I realize I know less and less, it makes it more valuable to say, maybe I better listen a little longer before I prejudge what the answer is. The other thing I do a lot of times, if someone's saying something to me that's really bothering me, like, it's starting to, you know that feeling you get when you're like, oh, I don't like that, I'm not, then I think, wait a second, like, why am I reacting that? Why am I so defensive about this? Let me give you a little example at Seagate that came up. So, there's no one from the SEC here, is there? No. No, the reason I ask is, so Seagate is, as I may have showed you, we're kind of moving into these other areas of business. Maria mentioned it. Of our $15 billion of revenue, $14 billion of it is making disk drives. But we're moving into flash systems, performance accelerator cards, storage systems, software, and all these things. And there's a construct in SEC accounting that's called segment reporting, which says that as you expand into different areas of business conduct, to have transparency for your shareholders, you should start doing segment reporting. So you should be giving detailed P&L information about all those different lines of businesses, as opposed to saying, we just make disk drives. Most companies don't want to do that. And they say they don't want to do that because they say for competitive reasons they don't want to do that, which may be partially true. But oftentimes the reason they don't want to do it is because they don't want to put up with the pressure of someone saying, wow, business unit B doesn't look very good. If you can all wrap it up in one happy towel, that's fine. But when you can actually start splitting it out, you increase the probability that someone could find criticism. And so at Seagate, and then there's all sorts of rules about when you do segment reporting or not. And at Seagate, we've kind of had the typical corporate reaction, which is, we want to kind of not do segment reporting for as long as possible, in part because competitively, we're doing stuff that Western Digital isn't. And then it dawned on me the other day, it's like, but as a manager, because we're not doing that type of accounting, we may not be allocating our resources correctly because we're doing things like saying, for all of our IT expense, it's all basically being charged to the drive company, but there could be a big hunk of our IT expense that's actually has to do with this expansion. And if we allocated those expense better, maybe we'd make better resource decisions. So I woke up thinking like, I've always had this visceral opposition to segment. It's like, no. So I went to the team and I said, you know what? We should do segment reporting. Let's just go do segment reporting. Now, whether or not we report it to the SEC is a different question, but from a management perspective, let's start doing it. And so I think, again, in your personal lives, your professional lives, whenever you find yourself immediately rejecting something, I think more often than not, it's actually telling you something about yourself that you have to kind of take a little harder look at to understand what is the fear about. What are you actually fearing that person's saying that's really bugging you? And it's not usually what you retort to that person, by the way. And so I just think you have to have the confidence to consider a different point of view, and you can't be insecure. And what does that mean? It means you need to be considerate. So I kind of break it down into honor, virtue, consideration, and if you kind of exhibit those characteristics, I think more often than not, you can be an effective leader. I've done a lot of debating and talking about are leaders born or made, and my answer is yes. There's kids I knew that, the first day you met them when they're 4 years old, you knew they were going to be leaders. And they were, and there's others that you thought were and they weren't. And then there's certainly ones that, until a particular situation came up with a particular group of individuals, you would have never thought that person was a leader, and then boom, they were the ones that made it all happen. And that's when I started thinking about what is that dynamic that causes that, and kind of went through this theory. So that's how I think of leadership. And I think it's a really important thing because the world needs leaders, because our problems are getting very complex and they're basically getting life-threatening. And if we don't figure out how to put the right people in positions of leadership, we got a harder task ahead of us than we need to have, and it's a pretty hard task anyhow. So with that upbeat finish, let me open it up for some questions and answers. Thanks.